Okay, so this next video is going to be the start of a series of videos that's going to go through chapter 13 for the book related to the course. In this particular chapter, we're going to be talking about two things primarily, which is being able to use cascading style sheets, or CSS, alongside our JavaFX applications, as well as going through a handful of more advanced controls. This is going to include things like radio buttons, checkboxes, the file chooser class, which is used to be able to open up or to save files on your computer system, as well as menu systems, so kind of like the menus that you typically see at the top of any application with all of their individual menu items to choose from. Okay. So for this first part, what we're going to go through is a little bit about CSS. With this particular video, I'm going to talk about sort of an introduction to CSS, where I'm going to primarily explain how we're going to go about getting it set up and exactly what CSS, these cascading style sheets, actually are. So there are going to be two major components when it comes to our JavaFX applications. There's going to be the actual Java program that we write. So we're going to have one side of it over here. So you can imagine that this is, if you open a window with your text editor, you have some Java code inside of here. This is basically your Java program. On this side, where you'd find all of your Java-related code. This basically is how we're going to go about actually creating the application itself. So this tends to be where we define the structure and the functionality of our JavaFX applications. And then on the other side of things, we're going to have our CSS, or our cascading style sheets. So I'm going to add that in. Okay, let's place that here. All right, and with the cascading style sheets, as you can tell from the name, kind of included right in there, this is going to be the half of our JavaFX applications that we're using to actually define the style of those applications. So this allows us to add additional things if we want to kind of fine-tune things like the color, the general appearance, essentially the aesthetic of our application. In the case of text, this deals with things like being able to bolden text, underline text, choose a particular font family that we want to use for our text. There's a whole bunch of things related to style that we can do through our cascading style sheets. All right, so this is going to be the distinction between these two different components. And so primarily what I'm going to focus on here is with CSS for the next couple of videos. So we'll create a pretty simple JavaFX application, and then we'll kind of go through the steps of actually adding a little bit of style to that application. All right. The next thing I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about is how we are going to go about actually setting up CSS in our environment. So for this particular part, I want to talk a little bit about the directory for our projects. So the way this is going to work is that typically, if you're looking at this from the perspective of some kind of IDE like NetBeans or Eclipse, you're going to be dealing with, at the top level, the overall project directory. That is to say, some folder on your computer system that just holds all of the additional folders and files related to your program, your application, whatever it happens to be. So that's going to include things like your source code, which has all of the Java files that you have personally written, as well as including an additional library that has the entire Java API available to you. So all of that stuff is typically going to be packaged together in a single project. So at the very top, we have our project directory. Make this a little bit smaller. And then inside of the project directory, we will have a few different components. So the two major components that I'm interested in here are going to be our Java API and then over here we're going to have our actual source code. And typically when it comes to most of our projects, the source code is going to be placed into a folder that's referred to something like source, maybe SRC for short. Inside of there, we're going to find some number of packages. So we'll have one or more packages that make up our project. For the majority of projects that we work on at kind of a fundamental level, say for Programming Fundamentals 1 and 2, we're mostly only going to be focusing on using one package per project. We're not really doing anything so complicated that we need multiple packages. We generally save that for applications that require several, maybe a few dozen different Java files that are broken up into different packages for the sake of keeping it more organized. In these particular cases, we're typically just going to deal with one package though. So let's imagine that we have just one single package. And in this one single package, we will have our Java files. So this will be our package. And as far as each one of these points go, our project directory, our source code, Java API, and our package, each one of these is essentially just a folder. When we talk about packages that we import into our applications, all it really means is that we're going out and getting some files that are inside of a folder. Okay. So this package that we have right here, inside of there, we will then find our source code. And in this case, this will be in the form of a Java file. And we'll recognize that it's a Java file since it has that .java extension, be a dead giveaway for it. In addition to the Java file, when it comes to our JavaFX applications going forward, the other thing that we're going to find inside of this package, so basically at this source directory level, this is where we're also going to be placing our CSS files. So in addition to that, we're going to have another point right here. And right here, this is where we'll go ahead and place our CSS. All right. So when we actually go about trying to create a new file that we want to put into here for that CSS file, we're going to be selecting the package. We'll create a new file for it. When you're dealing with Java files, typically what you're expected to do was to just make a new Java class. In the case of CSS, if you're trying to do this through something like NetBeans, use this as an example since I'm familiar with the process here. Typically the way that it's going to work is that you're going to see something like new, and then from there you're going to choose something like other, and then from there within the other selection there's going to be a dialog box that allows you to pick from one of many different kinds of files. Basically what you're looking for within that is going to be the cascading style sheets. So this whole process right here, this is what allows you to actually set up a CSS file, assuming that you want to do this directly in the in NetBeans itself from that project directory that's shown in the window, the interface for NetBeans. This is the general process that you would use. Alternatively, if you wanted to just go ahead and add this from the file system itself, you'd basically just go and open up the project, typically from like your documents, if you're on a Windows machine, somewhere in the library, or if you're on a Mac. From there, you'd go to NetBeans projects, and then you just look up the particular project, be whatever the name was that you gave it when you initially created it. Inside of that, you should find that source folder. You'd open up the source folder, then open up the package folder, and then just put your CSS file into that that folder that you opened up. So that's the general approach when it comes to actually getting it set up on your computer system. So in my case, since I'm doing this from just a simple text editor, it'll be a little bit simpler for me. What I'm going to essentially be doing is just creating two files here. So the first one is going to be the Java file. In this case, I'm going to call this something like style demo.java. So if you want to go ahead and make a project from your IDE, you can call it the same thing. And so that's just going to be placed into this Java projects folder. And then when I go about creating the CSS file, that as well will be placed into this folder. So it'll be pretty straightforward for me. Pretty typical convention if you're just going to put some generic style in your CSS file. At least from what I'm familiar with, you can just call it something like style.css. Making sure that when you, if you're doing it from the this little approach right here inside of NetBeans itself, you make sure that you've selected the right thing, so it should have the correct extension whenever you create the file. Make sure that it has that .css. Let's go ahead and save that. And so now I've got one of those added to our directory as well. Okay. The next thing I want to go ahead and do is just start setting up all of that boilerplate, all the standard lines of code that we always have to include for a JavaFX application. So let's go ahead and do all of my imports. So I'll do our application. We'll go ahead and get our stage. And we'll go ahead and get our scene. For this particular one, I suppose what we could start off with, for a fairly simple one, we'll do a single label. So we need our scene, control, label. Let's go ahead and get that and bring that in. And then we can go ahead and start setting up the application itself. So we'll start with our class header, so public class style demo. This extends application. Give it a main method. We'll call the launch method from inside of the main method. And then we'll go ahead and start setting up the start method. So public void start, our stage, primary stage. And then we can go ahead and start adding our code to the start method. So for this one, I said we'll just make a label. So we'll have a label. Label is equal to new label. For this one, what I'll go ahead and do for this first part, just a very simple demonstration, is to say this is some text. Then go ahead and create a scene. We'll just make that label the root node of it, since it'll be the only thing that we put into this application. For the dimensions on this one, it doesn't need to be very large. We'll do something like 100 by 100. And then in this next part, what we're going to do is actually take this style sheet, this CSS file that we created, and kind of attach that to the Java file in some way. So this is sort of like the equivalent of having to import a Java file, so kind of like what we did here. We just want to make sure that there's some relationship between these two so that the style can actually be applied to our application. So we're going to get the scene for this, and we're actually going to apply the style to the scene itself. So we're going to use the getStyleSheets method. This will give us the set of style sheets that are currently being applied to the scene. Right now there's nothing, so this would essentially be empty. And what we want to go ahead and do is add a style sheet to that. So we're going to use the add method. And inside of this add method, there's a set of steps, so some additional method calls I'm going to have to make in order to actually go get that style sheet and then kind of format it or set it up properly. So the first thing I need to do is actually get the Java file itself. And the way that I can do that is with this getClass method. So what this is going to do is essentially get the class that we're currently inside of when the application is running. So at runtime, that's going to be style demo. In this particular context, what that means is that we're getting the style demo file. And the next thing I want to go ahead and do once I've essentially fetched that file is to then go ahead and get one of the resources that I want to associate with that file. So we're going to do get resource. And this method will actually take a parameter, so there's an argument to put into this, which is going to be the name of the resource that I want to get. In this case, that's going to be style.css. And the way that this getResource method is going to work is that it's going to go look up the resource that I'm trying to attach, and it's going to give me back a URL, so essentially a kind of file path to that resource. Unfortunately, a URL is not something that we can use with the add method. What this is expecting is actually a string with the path to that CSS file. So what I want to then go ahead and do is just use toExternalForm, and this will go ahead and convert that URL back into a string so that it's compatible with the parameters for this add method. All right. And so once we've done all that, now our style sheet is actually being applied to our Java file. Then the last thing I want to go ahead and do is to just set up my stage. So we'll do primary stage.setScene. Give it the scene object that we created. We'll then go ahead and set the title. Call this style demo. And then finally, we'll go ahead and show this. So it'll be displayed. Alright, so we'll go ahead and compile this and run it just briefly to see that everything is working properly. So we'll go ahead and compile our style demo. Okay, and then we'll run it. Okay, so at this point it's displaying, although the dimensions seem to be a bit smaller than I wanted them to be. Let's see, to make sure that the title is displaying as well, we'll need to make this a little bit longer. Let's try something more like 250 for the width. Okay, let's go ahead and save it like that. So right now, as you probably noticed, it doesn't really look any different than if I just ran this without this line being applied at all. It's still just displaying some text with nothing interesting happening to it. So we probably want to go ahead and fix this a little bit so that something more interesting is actually taking place. So in order to do that, we need to add something to our CSS file. So we need to provide some kind of style. So in order to provide some kind of style, what we need to do is add some code to our CSS file. This is going to require adhering to whatever the syntax for CSS is. So much like with our Java programs, you'll know that there is a particular syntax, so there's a set of rules that dictates precisely how we go about writing a single line of code in Java. Same for any other programming language. In the case of CSS, while this is not precisely a programming language, it is at least still a language, so it still has its own set of rules that we have to follow. In this particular case, we need to make sure that we are doing two things. The first is specifying what we want to apply style to, and then the second thing is determining the kind of style that we want to apply to that particular item or that particular element in our application. So in this case, what I want to do is apply some style to my label. So in order to do that, I need to specify something in my CSS file that indicates that I'm applying style to labels. And the way that I do that is we use a dot, and then we use the name of the type of control that we want to apply the style to. So in this case, that's going to be the label. So this style will be applied to every label that is in our application. In this case, it's just going to be the one label that we've created. Then have a set of curly braces. So this is going to make up the body of this particular set of properties that I want to specify. And for each one of these, it's going to be a kind of pair where we specify the name of the property that I want to modify, and then I provide some kind of rule or guideline for that property. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to go ahead and change the color of all of my labels. To do that, I'll do the name of the rule, which will be something like fx text fill, and then I'll go ahead and specify a color of some kind. So the color in this case, it could just be the name of a color. It would be one possible example that I can show. So let's say I want to make all of the text red. So just go ahead and save it like that. And so now with this one single line that I've added to my CSS file, that will now be applied to my scene, since we're adding it to the scene through this get style sheets line right here on 20 right here. And so now that we've got all that, we'll just go ahead and compile this and run it. And now we can see that the text right here for this label has turned red. So this is showing just a quick example of setting up the environment for our CSS files, and then just adding a very simple line to a CSS file so we can demonstrate exactly how it works. All right. So in the next couple of videos, what I'm going to start going through is a bit more detail about things like the selectors and properties, so the general syntax of CSS files. I'm also going to go in a fair bit more depth about being able to use colors in CSS, since in addition to what I've done so far, there's a few other slightly more complicated rules that come with colors. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit at the end about how we might be able to create JavaFX applications where the style is actually included inside of the Java program itself without the inclusion of an external CSS sheet or a CSS file.